By the year 1300 AD, the conversion of Europe to Christianity was complete. England, Christian; France, Christian; Spain, Portugal, Germany, Scandinavia, Poland, Hungary, Bohemia, Christian; the Byzantine East, Christian for 1,000 years. Even the Mongol Khans, who had once threatened to swallow Europe alive, had, by the late 13th century, begun to bow their heads toward Mecca. There was one exception. In the dense forests of the Baltic, in a landlocked kingdom of oak groves and river valleys, shielded from conquest by swamp and forest and the sheer ferocity of its people, an ancient fire was still burning. It had been burning for longer than anyone could remember. The priests who tended it were called Vaidilutes, sacred women sworn to the flame. The god they served was Perkunas, the thunder god, master of storms and war, whose symbol was the oak tree and whose enemies were everything that slithered in the dark. The flame could not go out. The penalty for letting it go out was death. This was Lithuania, the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, and it was the last officially pagan state in medieval Europe. The Lithuanians had not simply failed to convert, they actively, intelligently, and militarily resisted conversion for over 2 centuries, fighting off the Teutonic Knights, the German crusading order sent specifically to baptize them by force, with a combination of tactical brilliance, geographical advantage, and a refusal to accept that their way of life was inferior to anyone else's. They were not primitive, they were not savages. The Grand Duchy of Lithuania was a sophisticated, multi-ethnic empire with its own legal codes, diplomatic networks, and trade relationships stretching across Eastern Europe. Its rulers spoke multiple languages, corresponded with foreign courts, and managed populations of Orthodox Christians, Catholic Christians, Jews, Tatars, and pagans with a pragmatism that most medieval rulers could not match. But at its core, at its heart, in its rituals and its identity, Lithuania was pagan. Its rulers worshipped at sacred groves, its dead were burned on pyres with their weapons and their horses, its priestesses tended an eternal fire that the Christian world found deeply, personally offensive. And in 1345, the man who would make Lithuania the largest state in Europe seized power. His name was Algirdas. Algirdas was born around 1296, one of 7 sons of Grand Duke Gediminas. He was not the chosen heir. His father had designated the youngest son, Jaunutis, as successor to Vilnius and the Grand Ducal throne. Algirdas spent his early years as a regional prince in the east, governing territories that brought him into constant contact with Orthodox Russian principalities. He married into Russian nobility. He learned their language, their customs, their political structures. He watched how they fought, how they failed. He filed everything away. In 1345, when it became clear that his brother Jaunutis was incapable of holding the duchy together, Algirdas moved. With the help of his other brother Kestutis, a straightforward warrior who would handle the western frontier for the next 30 years, Algirdas drove Jaunutis out of Vilnius and declared himself Grand Duke. He was approximately 45 years old. He would rule for the next 32 years, and in that time he would transform a small Baltic duchy into the largest state in Europe, while never, not once, kneeling before a Christian god. Here is what his contemporaries said about Algirdas, and what made him different from almost every other ruler of his age. He did not drink. In a medieval European court, this was almost incomprehensibly strange. Feasting and drinking were the social glue of political life, the way alliances were formed, trust was built, information was exchanged. A ruler who refused to drink was a ruler who could not be read. A ruler who watched while others grew loose-tongued and indiscreet was a ruler who always knew more than he let on. Algirdas knew exactly what he was doing. He rose before dawn every day.
He revealed his military plans to no one, not his generals, not his brother, not his wives. He could be planning a campaign for months, and his own court would not know until the army was already moving. The chronicler Wigand of Marburg, writing for the Teutonic Knights, his enemies, described him with something approaching awe. He wrote that Algirdas was a man who could strike without warning anywhere along a frontier that stretched for hundreds of miles, because no one ever knew where he was going next, not even his allies. He was feared more than any other king because he waged war with silence rather than noise. While Algirdas ran the eastern strategy, expanding into Russian and Tartar territories, playing Moscow and the Orthodox Church against each other with extraordinary skill, Kęstutis held the western frontier against the Teutonic Knights. This division of labor was one of the most effective political partnerships in medieval European history. Kęstutis was everything Algirdas was not: bold, physically imposing, beloved by his soldiers, a warrior who led from the front. He fought the Teutonic Knights so many times that medieval chroniclers lost count. The German crusading order, which had spent 2 centuries slowly grinding its way through the Baltic peoples, found that Lithuania simply would not break. The Knights launched what they called Ryzen, seasonal military raids into Lithuanian territory, campaigns of deliberate devastation designed to exhaust the pagan population into submission. They burned villages, they killed livestock, they took captives, they built stone fortresses at the frontier and advanced them year by year. And then Kęstutis would come out of the forest, burn the fortress, release the captives, and disappear back into the trees. This went on for decades. The Teutonic Knights, one of the most formidable military organizations in medieval Europe, could not break 2 brothers and a forest. While Kęstutis held the west, Algirdas was building an empire in the east with methodical, relentless efficiency. In 1362, at the Battle of Blue Waters on the southern Bug River, Algirdas defeated 3 Tartar commanders simultaneously and shattered the Golden Horde's grip on the territories of modern-day Ukraine. He took Kiev, the ancient city of Slavic civilization, the ancient capital of Rus, and absorbed it into Lithuania. The Mongols, who had terrorized Eastern Europe for a century, retreated to the Crimea. He absorbed Podolia, Chernihiv, Volhynia, territories that stretched toward the Black Sea. He brought the ancient Slavic principalities, Smolensk, Bryansk, into his orbit. By the mid-1660s, the Grand Duchy of Lithuania stretched from the Baltic Sea in the northwest to within striking distance of the Black Sea in the south. It was by territory the largest state in Europe, and its ruler still worshipped thunder gods and attended ceremonies at sacred oak groves and had never been baptized.
In 1368, Algirdas did something that no Western European power had managed and that would not be repeated for centuries. He marched an army to the walls of Moscow and camped outside the Kremlin. The dispute was over the Principality of Tver, Moscow's rival, whose duke was Algirdas's brother-in-law. The Muscovite Grand Duke Dmitry, later called Dmitry Donskoy, the man who would eventually break Mongol power at the Battle of Kulikovo, had been pressuring Tver, and Algirdas considered this a direct challenge to Lithuanian influence in the region. He mobilized his army in absolute secrecy, which was his signature. The Muscovite border guards reported his approach only when the Lithuanian army was already too close to stop. Dmitry barely had time to retreat inside the Kremlin's stone walls. The Lithuanian forces burned the surrounding city, the Posad, and camped outside for 3 days. The Kremlin held. Algirdas did not have siege equipment adequate to take it. After 3 days, he withdrew. 2 years later, in 1370, he came back. He burned the Posad again. He camped outside again. The Kremlin held again. He withdrew again.
The Metropolitan of Moscow, the head of the Orthodox Church, was so outraged that he excommunicated every Russian prince who had cooperated with Algirdas. The Patriarch of Constantinople, the head of the Orthodox world, wrote letters condemning Algirdas as a fire-worshipping pagan who was a menace to Christian civilization. Algirdas sent the Patriarch a letter in return. It was a masterpiece of diplomatic audacity. He called himself the King of Lithuania, listed his grievances against Moscow in precise legal terms, demanded his own separate metropolitan bishop for his Orthodox subjects, and pointed out correctly that his Orthodox subjects were being discriminated against by a church whose political bias was nakedly Muscovite. He wrote this letter as a pagan. A pagan king lecturing the Patriarch of Constantinople on the rights of Orthodox Christians and being technically correct about it was not something the medieval world had seen before. Modern historians have identified something fascinating about Algirdas's religious policy. Paganism itself was a diplomatic weapon. By remaining officially pagan, Algirdas kept all options open. He could negotiate with Catholic powers in the West by hinting at potential conversion, a conversion that would neutralize the Teutonic Knights' justification for their crusade against Lithuania. He could maintain close relationships with his Orthodox subjects in the East without committing to the Orthodox Church's political agenda, which was increasingly aligned with Moscow. His wives were Orthodox. Many of his children were baptized Orthodox. He built Orthodox churches in Vilnius for his subjects. He corresponded respectfully with Orthodox hierarchs, but he himself remained to his death outside the Christian world, and that outsider status gave him a freedom of movement politically and diplomatically that no baptized ruler could match. He was not a pagan out of ignorance or stubbornness. He was a pagan out of calculation, which makes him one of the most sophisticated political minds of the 14th century, a century that includes Edward III of England, Charles V of France, and the early Visconti dukes of Milan.
To understand Algirdas, you need to understand what he was defending, what the sacred fires and the oak groves and the thunder god actually meant to the Lithuanian people he ruled. Baltic paganism was not a primitive or simple belief system. It was an ancient, sophisticated understanding of the world that had developed over millennia, preserving elements so old that modern linguists and mythologists have identified direct connections to Proto-Indo-European religious concepts that predate ancient Greece and Rome. The thunder god Perkunas, whose name is linguistically related to the Vedic Parjanya, the Norse Thor, the Slavic Perun, was not merely a weather deity. He was the principle of cosmic order, the force that drove away darkness and serpents and the powers of chaos. His sacred symbol was the oak tree, the tallest tree that lightning most often strikes, because lightning was Perkunas himself, reaching down to touch the world. The eternal fire, the fire that the Vaidilutes tended in Vilnius, was not a symbol. It was a living presence, a connection between the human world and the divine. If it went out, the connection was broken, the cosmos tilted, bad things happened. The dead were buried or burned with their possessions because the other world was not an abstraction. It was a real place you went to, and you needed your things when you arrived. Algirdas's own father, Gediminas, had been burned on a pyre with his weapons, his horses, and his servants. When Algirdas himself died in 1377, he was burned in a sacred oak grove near Vilnius, according to the same ancient rites, with 18 horses cremated alongside him. 18 horses, the last ruler of Europe's last pagan empire, departing the world the way his ancestors had departed it for 2,000 years.
On May 24th, Algirdas's body was burned on a funeral pyre in a sacred oak grove near Vilnius, according to the pagan custom. Cremated with Algirdas were 18 horses and many of his valuables. For 2 centuries, the Teutonic Knights had been the instrument of Christian Europe's attempt to convert Lithuania. They had been extraordinarily effective everywhere else. The Prussians, the Livians, the Estonians, the Latvians, all the other Baltic peoples had been Christianized by a combination of military force, settlement, and the slow, grinding pressure of a military order with unlimited funding from across Catholic Europe. Lithuania resisted, and the reason was geography as much as will. The Lithuanian heartland was protected by the Nemunas river system, by marshes and forests that were impassable to heavy cavalry, by a terrain that neutralized the Teutonic Knights' greatest advantage and favored the kind of fast, mobile guerrilla warfare at which Lithuanian warriors excelled. The knights came anyway, year after year, in their armored columns with their siege weapons and their priests and their letters of authorization from the Pope. And year after year, Kęstutis emerged from the forest and hit them on the flanks and burned their supply lines and vanished before they could bring their main force to bear. The knights called these campaigns holy. The Lithuanians called them theft. Both were correct. Algirdas died in May 1377. He had ruled for 32 years. Under his leadership, Lithuania had grown from a regional Baltic duchy into the largest state in Europe, stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea, encompassing modern-day Lithuania, Latvia, Belarus, much of Ukraine, and parts of Russia. He had never lost a major campaign. He had neutralized the Mongols, contained Moscow, resisted the Teutonic Knights, and built a functioning multi-ethnic empire that governed Orthodox Christians, Catholic Christians, Jews, Tatars, and pagans under a single authority. And he had done all of this while worshipping Perkunas and tending the sacred fire and keeping the old ways alive in a world that had spent 2 centuries trying to extinguish them. He was burned in his oak grove with his horses. His sons divided the duchy between them, and almost immediately the dynasty that he had built began to face a question he had successfully avoided for 32 years. How long could the last pagan empire in Europe survive in a world that no longer had room for it? The answer turned out to be 10 years. Algirdas's son, Jogaila, inherited a duchy under siege from every direction. The Teutonic Knights had not stopped. Moscow had not retreated. And to the south and west, the Kingdom of Poland had a problem. Its queen, the young Jadwiga, needed a husband, and its nobility needed a powerful ally against the same German pressure that was throttling Lithuania. A deal was proposed. Jogaila would marry Jadwiga, uniting Lithuania and Poland. He would convert to Christianity, bringing Lithuania into the Catholic fold. In exchange, he would receive the Polish crown and the full diplomatic and military weight of the Polish kingdom as an ally. Jogaila accepted in 1386. He was baptized on February 15th of that year, receiving the Christian name Władysław. He married Jadwiga 3 days later. And then he went home to Lithuania and did what Christendom had been demanding for 200 years. He arrived in Vilnius with Polish clergy and the Archbishop of Gniezno. The Perkunas temple was torn down, the sacred altars were smashed, the eternal flame, the fire that had burned for generations in the sacred precinct of Vilnius, was extinguished for the first time in living memory. The sacred serpents that Lithuanian households had kept as household guardians, fed with milk and honored as spirits of the home, were killed. The statues of the goddesses were seized and thrown into the Neris River. The ancient oak groves, the holiest spaces in the Baltic pagan world, places where the divine and the human had met for thousands of years, were felled with axes. It took less than a year. 2,000 years of sacred tradition erased in less than a year. The eternal flame that had burned for generations was extinguished. The serpents were killed. The statues of the goddesses were seized and drowned in the nearest river. The ancient oak groves were felled with axes. The church did not permit memory of the old ways. What Algirdas had defended for 32 years, what his father had defended before him and his grandfather before that, was not simply a religion. It was an entire understanding of the world, of time, of death, of the relationship between the human and the sacred. When the oak groves fell and the flame went out, the institutional support for that understanding was gone. No more priestesses, no more sacred fires, no more public ritual in the old tradition. The new Christian clergy arrived and began building churches on the sites of the old sacred spaces, a common technique of religious conquest, layering the new faith over the geography of the old. Algirdas himself was not erased by any single decision. He was erased by the logic of what came after. His son's conversion made the old Lithuania illegitimate in retrospect. The Teutonic Knights, who continued to threaten Lithuania even after the conversion, until their decisive defeat at Grunwald in 1410, had spent 2 centuries describing Lithuanian paganism as barbarism. That description became, slowly, the historical record. The man who built the largest state in Europe while worshipping thunder gods became a footnote in his own dynasty's history, overshadowed by the Christian kings who came after him, who had the machinery of the church to preserve their memory and the motivation to distance themselves from their pagan past. And yet, the conversion was not complete. It could not be. 2,000 years of sacred practice does not vanish in a year or a decade or a century. Out in the Lithuanian villages, the old ways went underground. The hearth fire was still tended, quietly, with the same reverence that had once been given to the eternal flame. The household serpents were still fed milk in secret. The dead were still mourned with rituals the church had no name for. People still left offerings at the old sacred places, now Christianized, renamed, repurposed, but still somehow the same ground. Lithuanian folk tradition, preserved in songs called dainos and in the oral memory of rural communities, kept fragments of the old mythology alive for centuries. The linguists and mythologists who began studying Baltic religion seriously in the 19th century found, to their astonishment, that the tradition was far more intact than anyone had expected. Perkunas was still there in the folk memory. The old goddess figures was still there. The relationship between the human world and the natural world, between lightning and oak trees, between fire and continuity, between the living and the dead, was still there. The church burned the groves. It could not burn what the people carried in their heads. Algirdas of Lithuania is not remembered the way he should be. He does not have the name recognition of Charlemagne or Saladin or Edward I or any of the other great rulers of medieval Europe, whose deeds fill the history books. But consider what he actually did. He built the largest state in Europe. He defeated the Mongols. He held off the Teutonic Knights for 30 years. He governed a multi-ethnic, multi-religious empire with a tolerance and sophistication that most of his Christian contemporaries could not match. He was feared by the Byzantine Patriarch, excommunicated by the Metropolitan of Moscow, and respected by enemies who could not defeat him. And he did it all while openly, proudly, defiantly worshiping the old gods, not because he was ignorant of Christianity, but because he understood with complete clarity that the old ways were worth defending and that paganism itself was a form of power that the Christian world could not touch. He was wrong in the end. His son gave it all away for a crown and a marriage, but for 32 years, in the 14th century, at the heart of medieval Europe, a pagan king held the line. The sacred fire burned, and when it finally went out, it took something with it that the world has never quite recovered.